I turned 40 on a Friday and didn't say a word to anyone. Most people expect balloons, a cake, or at least a phone call from family, but I had no appetite for any of it. After work, I carried my grocery bag down the cracked sidewalk toward my apartment building, the street lamps already humming above the quiet blocks of Lancaster. The smell of damp leaves clung to the evening air, mixing with the faint scent of manure that always drifted in from the farms outside town. I had grown used to silence. My husband was gone, my son was stationed far away, and birthdays had become just another square on the calendar. Still, that night felt particularly heavy, as if the number itself pressed down on me. Half a block from home, a voice broke the stillness. Mrs. Antonia Jenkins from downstairs was at it again, her sharp tone slicing through the dusk. She stood near the dumpsters, arms folded, scolding a group of homeless men who had gathered there to escape the wind. She called them bums, told them to leave, accused them of frightening children. 4 of them matched the picture she painted: shabby coats, layers of grime, the kind of wear that winter never forgives. But one stood out. He sat a little apart, shoulders squared, a dark hat pulled low over his face. His clothes were worn but brushed off, his jaw cleanly shaved. There was a quiet dignity about him, the kind that doesn't belong in an alley behind an apartment block. He didn't argue with Mrs. Jenkins, didn't even look up, just sat there as though the shouting belonged to another world. I slowed without meaning to, my eyes catching on him before I climbed the steps to my floor. By the time I put water on for tea, I was still thinking of the man in the hat, still wondering who he had been before ending up on that curb. I tried to shake it off. It was just another night, just another voice carried on the wind. But even as I lay in bed, the image lingered. The next morning, I woke early. Saturdays were for the cabin, a small place my parents left me up in the Pocono Hills. 2 rooms, a crooked porch, and land that smelled of pine needles after the rain. It was my refuge, the only place where I could breathe without feeling the walls pressing in. I packed a canvas bag with bread, coffee, and tools for small repairs, then stepped outside into the pale dawn. As I cut through the alley toward the bus stop, I saw him again. The same hat, the same quiet presence, only this time he lifted his head. Not too early for work. His voice was low and careful, as if he didn't want to scare me off. "It's my day off," I said. "I'm heading to my cabin. Always something to fix up before the weather turns." He nodded, eyes steady. "I can help, if you'll let me. I don't need money. I know how to carry, hammer, dig. Sometimes a place just needs another pair of hands." I froze, caught between caution and something harder to name. A woman alone learns to stack reasons for saying no. But then I noticed the way he carried himself, shoulders set like a man who knew work, who hadn't completely surrendered to despair. "You'd need clothes," I heard myself say, "and a chance to clean up. People complain if you ride a county bus looking like that." He glanced down, not ashamed, only practical. "Fair enough. My late husband's things are packed away," I continued. "I could bring a set to the cabin. There's an old shower out back. If you want to meet me there, you can change. Then we'll see how it goes." He touched the brim of his hat, a gesture so old-fashioned it startled me. "Daniel," he said simply. "Linda," I answered. The bus pulled up then, hissing at the curb, and the moment ended before it could brake. The cabin always greeted me the same way. Pine needles scattered across the porch, a stubborn door that stuck in damp weather, the faint smell of wood smoke from old winters. But that morning it felt different because Daniel walked a few steps behind me, silent, as though he didn't want to intrude on the rhythm of my life. I set the canvas bag on the porch and handed him the clothes I had carried, my late husband's old jeans, a flannel shirt, a jacket still sturdy though softened by years of wear. He took them without hesitation, his eyes meeting mine with a gratitude that didn't need words. "The shower's out back," I said. "Water's not fancy, but it'll do the job." He nodded and disappeared around the side of the cabin. I busied myself inside, sweeping the floor, unpacking groceries, trying not to imagine how he might look once the grime was gone. The sound of running water came faintly through the wall, followed by the scrape of a razor against skin. When he returned nearly an hour later, I had to steady myself. The man in the hat was gone. In his place stood someone entirely different, hair combed, face clean, clothes fitting as though they had been waiting for him all along. He looked less like a stranger passing through, and more like a man who belonged somewhere. "You clean up well," I said, my voice lighter than I intended. He smiled, just a small curve of the mouth. "Feels good to feel human again." The hours unfolded easily after that. Daniel split logs with a practice swing, stacked them neatly by the wall, raked the yard clear of leaves that had smothered the grass. I joined him in the garden, pulling weeds, tidying the flower beds my mother once tended. He carried the heavy things without being asked, lifted the ladder so I could patch the gutter, and never once complained. By late afternoon, sweat darkened the flannel shirt, and his hands bore the marks of work. Yet there was a calmness about him, a steadiness I hadn't felt around anyone in a long time. It was as though the cabin itself recognized him, allowed him in. When the sun dipped low, I cooked a simple dinner, potatoes fried with onions, bread warmed in the oven, apple sliced with cinnamon sugar. We ate on the porch steps, plates balanced on our knees, the air cooling as the hills swallowed the last of the light. Afterward, I made tea. We carried our mugs outside and sat beneath the wide, open sky. The stars came slowly at first, then all at once, scattering themselves across the darkness. Daniel leaned back against the railing, his eyes fixed upward. "Do you know Orion?" he asked, pointing with his chin. "There, the belt, 3 bright stars in a row. You follow it west, and you'll find Aldebaran. Follow it east, and there's Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky." I followed his gaze, tracing the map he drew in words. His voice carried a quiet reverence, as though he wasn't just naming stars but recalling old friends. He spoke of constellations like they were stories, threads that stitched time and people together. I listened, cut not only by what he knew, but by how he said it, with patience, with certainty, with a depth that made the universe feel less lonely. The cool night wrapped around us, the tea grew cold in my hands, but I didn't move. For the first time in years, I felt the kind of silence that heals rather than hurts. When I finally looked away from the stars, I realized I was studying his profile instead, the clean lines of his face against the sky. And I thought, without daring to say it aloud, that maybe this weekend had changed something in both of us. By Sunday evening, I left the hills behind and returned to town. The bus dropped me 2 blocks from my apartment, and as soon as I turned onto East Walnut, I felt eyes on me. Curtains shifted, doors cracked open. In a small building like ours, everyone keeps track of who goes out, who comes back, and who isn't alone when they do it. Mrs. Antonia Jenkins was waiting at the steps, arms crossed, lips pursed so tightly they seemed to have forgotten how to soften. She was the self-appointed guardian of the block, the kind of neighbor who knew how long you left your car parked and whether your mail stacked up for more than a day. "Well, well," she said as I came closer. "Where'd you take that filthy fellow? Don't tell me you've gone and made friends with the trash behind our dumpsters." Her voice carried easily, sharp enough that other tenants opened their doors wider, eager for the show. I stopped 2 steps below her, grocery bag in hand, the weekends quiet, still clinging to me. "If you mean the man I was with," I said evenly, "his name is Daniel. And yes, I know where I took him. That's my business, Mrs. Jenkins, not yours." Her eyes narrowed, pleased to have the name. "Daniel, is it? What kind of woman runs off to the woods with a stranger she found in the gutter? You're 40, Linda, not 20. People are talking. They say you've lost your sense." I could feel the heat rising around me, her words, the stares of neighbors leaning over banisters. For a moment, I considered brushing past, locking the door, and leaving them their whispers. But something inside me had shifted out at the cabin. I wasn't the same woman who had walked home alone on her birthday. "I'm 40, yes," I said, keeping my tone calm. "That means I know how to make my own choices. I know who I trust and why, and I don't need anyone's permission. A silence followed, heavy as the August air. Then Mrs. Callahan from 2B spoke up, her voice carrying down the hall. Let her be, Antonia. Linda's always minded her business. If she wants company, that's her right. Someone else muttered agreement. Another neighbor added, he looked decent enough once he'd cleaned up, better than some who come and go around here. The hallway divided in an instant, some nodding toward me with quiet support, others clicking their tongues, feeding off Antonia's disapproval. She drew herself taller, glaring at those who dared defend me, but the momentum had shifted. She no longer owned the air the way she usually did. I climbed the last steps, met her stare, and unlocked my door. Good night, I said simply and shut it behind me. Inside, the familiar stillness wrapped around me. I set down the bag, poured a glass of water, and leaned against the counter. My hands were steady, but my thoughts were not, because all I could think about was Daniel, how he had looked in the flannel shirt, how his voice had mapped the constellations, how he had carried the weight of the day without complaint. The neighbors could gossip all they wanted. Their words couldn't change the truth that lingered in me. I turned out the kitchen light and stood at the window. The town was quiet again, only the faint glow of the street lamp and the occasional hum of a car passing by. Somewhere out there, Daniel was sleeping, maybe on the narrow bed in the cabin, maybe beneath the stars he loved so much. And I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that my thoughts would stay with him long after the whispers in the hallway faded. The following weekend, I carried a paper sack filled with groceries onto the bus, the kind of simple things that could stretch into meals if you had patience. Bread, cheese, tomatoes, a small roast chicken wrapped in foil. The bus jolted along country roads until the hills opened and the familiar path appeared. I stepped off into the crisp air, my heart quickening without my permission. The cabin came into view, and for a moment I thought I had arrived at the wrong place. The front steps, once sagging, had been repaired, the porch swept clear. The yard looked tidier than I had ever seen it in autumn. Leaves that usually piled up against the walls were raked into neat mounds. The stubborn weeds that had choked the garden were gone, and there, bent over a wheelbarrow, was Daniel. He straightened when he saw me, wiping his hands against his jeans. Figured your parents would scold me from wherever they are if I let the place fall apart, he said with a half smile. I set the groceries on the porch rail, trying to hide how much the sight moved me. They'd thank you, I said softly. Inside, the cabin held another surprise. The small wooden table was dressed as though someone had raided a forgotten corner of romance. A wildflower bouquet sat in a chipped mason jar. 2 mismatched candles burned steadily, and a bottle of inexpensive red wine rested between 2 glasses. The sunlight streaming through the window caught the dust motes, turning them into tiny sparks in the air. I turned to him, startled. Daniel, what is this? He shifted on his feet like a boy caught doing something foolish. I thought maybe dinner deserved to be more than bread on the porch. It's not much, but it's beautiful, I interrupted, and I meant it. We ate slowly, laughing over the roast chicken that fell apart too quickly, savoring the wine even though it was tart and thin. The candles flickered, casting shadows across his face, softening the angles, making him look younger than he had on the street corner days ago. When the plates were pushed aside, silence settled between us, not heavy but waiting. A radio sat on the counter, one I hadn't turned on in years. Daniel walked over, turned the dial, and after a crackle of static, a low, old tune drifted out, something smooth and lilting. He held out his hand, uncertain, almost shy. I haven't danced since high school, he admitted. I stared at that hand, then placed mine in it. Then we'll stumble together. We moved awkwardly at first, feet colliding, shoulders stiff. But soon the rhythm carried us, and the cabin floor creaked under our steps. We swayed more than danced, laughing when we lost the beat, holding on tighter when we nearly tripped. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, stars glinting above the dark trees. Inside, time seemed to fold, carrying me backward to when I was young, when I still believed the world could surprise me. His hand was warm at my waist, his breath steady near my ear. For the first time since my husband's death, I felt alive in a way I had forgotten was possible, not just surviving, not just moving through days, but opening, blooming, daring to let joy return. When the song ended, we stood still, reluctant to let go. My heart beat hard, not from the clumsy dancing, but from the realization that something long dormant inside me had stirred awake. I left the cabin that Sunday evening lighter than I had felt in years. Daniel had insisted on staying behind, saying he wanted to finish some repairs before the cold set in. I waved from the bus window as the hills gave way to farmland, carrying with me the memory of candlelight and laughter, the sound of our clumsy steps on the wooden floor. Back in town, life resumed its old rhythm. Grocery lists, laundry, the buzz of neighbors' chatter spilling through thin walls. But beneath it all was a hum of anticipation. I knew I'd see him again the next weekend, and that thought alone carried me through the week. Then the phone rang late Wednesday afternoon. It wasn't anyone I knew, just a neighbor from up near the cabin, a man who lived down the dirt road. His voice was rushed, breathless. He'd found Daniel collapsed in the yard, doubled over in pain, unable to stand. The ambulance had come, taken him to the hospital in Scranton. That was all he knew. The words barely settled before I was out the door, coat half buttoned, keys in my fist. I drove as fast as the old sedan would carry me, the world narrowing to the stretch of highway and the sound of my own heart pounding in my ears. By the time I reached the hospital, night had fallen. The fluorescent lights made the corridors feel harsher, less forgiving. At the front desk, the clerk asked for a name. "Daniel Porter," I said. She frowned, tapped at her screen. "We have a John Doe brought in from a cabin outside town. Mid-40s, no identification." My chest tightened. "That's him," I whispered. "Are you family?" I hesitated only a second. "I'm his wife." The lie slid out smoother than I expected, but it was the only way past the barrier. Without paperwork, strangers aren't allowed back. Wives are. They led me down a sterile hallway that smelled faintly of antiseptic and fear. Through the glass I saw him, pale against the sheets, oxygen mask in place, nurses moving quickly around him. A doctor intercepted me, his expression grave. "He came in with a perforated ulcer," the doctor explained. "We had to operate immediately. The surgery went well, but it was close. If he'd arrived an hour later, we might be having a very different conversation. He'll need rest, careful monitoring, and strict changes to his diet and habits." I nodded, though the words blurred at the edges. Relief and terror collided in me, leaving my hands trembling. When they finally let me sit beside him, I reached for his hand. It was cool, limp at first, then slowly tightened around mine. His eyelids fluttered, and for a moment those familiar eyes met mine through the haze of medication. "You're here," he murmured, voice raw. "I'm here," I said, leaning closer so he could hear the steadiness I didn't feel. "And I'm not leaving. Not now, not ever." The machines beeped steadily, marking time I no longer trusted. I held his hand as if that alone could tether him to the world, as if my presence could pull him back from the brink. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew the neighbors would keep gossiping, that questions would come about what tied me to this man I'd only just met. But none of that mattered in that hospital room. All I knew was the truth I'd spoken in that lie at the front desk. I was his and he was mine, whether the world recognized it or not. The days that followed blurred together under the glow of hospital lights. I went back and forth between Lancaster and Scranton with tote bags full of small comforts, books, clean shirts, soft blankets that smelled faintly of home. The doctors told me Daniel's stomach was fragile, his recovery depending on strict care. So I learned quickly. I read every pamphlet they handed me, sat through conversations about ulcers and diets, and filled notebooks with instructions. I boiled oatmeal until it was thin enough to slip down without effort, mashed sweet potatoes until they were smooth, brought yogurt and applesauce in small containers. Every morning before work and every evening after, I sat beside him. At first, he dozed more than he spoke, drifting in and out of sleep with the machines humming softly at his side. But as the days passed, color returned to his face, his eyes steadier, his voice stronger. "You keep showing up," he said one afternoon, half smiling as I set a tray in front of him. "Get used to it," I told him. "You're not scaring me off." Word traveled quickly through the hospital. Nurses began calling me Mrs. Porter, assuming I was his wife. I didn't correct them. Daniel, of course, played along with a mischievous glint in his eyes. "Darling," he would say when a nurse came to check his vitals, overplaying the endearment until I wanted to swat him. Yet beneath the humor was something tender, something that settled into the quiet between us. One evening, when the ward had grown still and the hallway lights dimmed, I leaned close to adjust his blanket. He caught my hand, held it against his chest where his heartbeat thudded steadily. "You've given me back my life, Linda," he whispered. I shook my head, but before I could argue, he tilted his face toward mine. The kiss was gentle, cautious, as though he feared I might pull away. I didn't. For a moment, the hospital walls disappeared. It was just us, two people who had been strangers weeks ago, now bound by something neither of us had expected. By the third week, Daniel was walking slowly with the help of a cane. The doctors cleared him for discharge with a list of restrictions that could have filled a book. He had no home to return to, no papers, no insurance. So I signed the forms, and together we began the slow process of piecing his identity back together. At the county office, I stood beside him as we filed for a new state ID, filled out the paperwork for a replacement social security card. Each form asked for proof he no longer had. Each signature felt like reclaiming a piece of the man he had once been. When I finally brought him back to Lancaster, the stares were immediate. Neighbors peeked from their doorways, whispering behind half-shut blinds. Mrs. Jenkins stood squarely in the hall, arms folded, ready to pounce. I carried Daniel's bag inside, then turned to face them all. "This is my husband," I said clearly. "He's living here now." The silence that followed was sharp, cut only by the squeak of a door hinge. Some frowned, others exchanged surprised glances, but no one challenged me. Not that night. Inside the apartment, Daniel sank carefully onto the couch, wincing as he lowered himself. I joined him, my hand finding his without thought. For the first time in years, the apartment didn't feel empty. The quiet had changed. It wasn't loneliness anymore. It was us. It was a gray evening in late October when Daniel finally told me everything. We sat across from each other at the small table in my apartment, the lamplight pooling between us. I had made soup, though neither of us had touched it. His eyes lingered on the steam rising from the bowl, as if he needed something to anchor him before he opened the door to a past he had kept locked away. "I wasn't always the man you found behind the dumpsters," he began quietly. "I used to have an empire, Linda. Not the kind with crowns and castles, but one made of steel beams and concrete. I built buildings that touched the skyline." He looked up, searching my face, perhaps for judgment, perhaps for disbelief. I only nodded, urging him on. Philadelphia was home. I started a construction company with 2 college friends, guys I trusted like brothers. We were nobodies at first, scraping by on small contracts, but within 10 years we were handling multi-million-dollar projects. High-rises, office complexes, even part of the new stadium downtown. I had money, respect. People shook my hand like I mattered. His voice faltered, and he leaned back, running a hand through his hair. That's when I met Kira. She was a lawyer, brilliant, ambitious, beautiful in that polished way that turned heads at every gala. I thought she loved me, thought we wanted the same life. We married quickly, too quickly, I see that now. At first, it was intoxicating, but then the coldness came. The laughter stopped. She stopped looking at me and started looking past me. A shadow crossed his face. I should have known. She had someone else. I never caught her red-handed, but I didn't need to. She stopped hiding her absences. The perfume that lingered wasn't mine to breathe. She looked at me like I was an obstacle instead of a husband. He gripped the edge of the table. Still, I had the company. That was my anchor. Until the night a set of blueprints vanished. They were for the biggest project we'd ever landed. A skyscraper that would have carried our name forever. Competitors got hold of them, underbid us, and we lost everything. Suddenly, our reputation was mud. Clients pulled out, investors withdrew. We were bleeding money. His hand trembled slightly, but his voice hardened. Stress ate me alive. I collapsed one morning at the office. Woke up in a hospital with doctors warning me about ulcers, blood pressure, the whole lot. While I was lying there, Kira showed up, not with flowers, but with papers. A power of attorney, she called it. Said it would protect me, let her and my partners handle things while I recovered. I was too weak, too drugged to argue. I signed. He paused, his jaw clenched, so tightly I could hear the grind of his teeth. That signature destroyed me. Within weeks, my so-called friends pushed me out. Kira emptied accounts I didn't even know she had access to. And when I started asking questions, when I threatened to fight back, things turned darker than I imagined. His voice dropped, almost a whisper. I was grabbed off the street one night, thrown into a van. They held me in a basement somewhere, no windows, just a light bulb and threats. For months, I was beaten, starved, reminded that I had nothing left. They shoved new documents in front of me, transfers, resignations, deeds. By the time they were done, the company wasn't mine anymore. Nothing was. The room seemed smaller as his words settled over us. I reached across the table, covered his hand with mine. His eyes glistened, but he held himself steady. That's how I became the man in the hat, he said. From empire to nobody. All it took was betrayal from the people I trusted most. When they finally let me go, I stumbled back into Philadelphia like a man crawling out of a grave. The city looked the same. Traffic roaring down Broad Street, neon lights flickering in diner windows. The smell of roasted peanuts from vendors on corners. But I was not the same. I carried months of hunger in my bones, bruises that would not fade, and a hollow ache where my life had been. The first place I went was my parents' house, the small brick row home where my mother had kept lace curtains and my father had mowed the tiny strip of grass as if it were a grand estate. I expected their relief, their embrace. Instead, I found strangers. A woman I'd never seen answered the door, holding a toddler on her hip. She looked at me with suspicion, like I was the intruder. "This is my parents' house," I said, my voice cracking. "Where are they?" Her husband appeared behind her. "The previous owners passed," he told me flatly. "We bought it 6 months ago." "I'm sorry, man, but you've got the wrong place." I staggered back down the steps, the words cutting deeper than any blow I had taken in that basement. My mother, who had once nursed me through every fever. My father, who had taught me to swing a hammer, who came to every ribbon cutting for my projects. Both gone. Later, I learned my mother had died of a stroke not long after I disappeared, and my father had followed her 2 months later, grief gnawing away the will to keep living. I still had one place left, the apartment Kira and I had shared, the glass-walled condo that looked out over the Schuylkill. I walked there with what strength I had left, imagining the relief of collapsing into my own bed, of demanding answers from the wife I had once trusted. But when I arrived, the lobby guard didn't recognize me. My key card no longer worked. Someone else's name was on the mailbox. A new tenant opened the door, confused by my presence. "We bought it from a woman named Kira months ago," he explained. "She said she was leaving the country for good." The words landed like stones. She had sold everything we built together. She had fled. I tried to track down my business partners, those men I once called brothers, but their offices were empty, their numbers disconnected. Rumor said they had taken their profits overseas, starting fresh where no one knew the blood that stained their success. So there I was, no parents, no wife, no friends, no home, no company. The empire I had poured my soul into was gone, my name smeared beyond repair. Without identification, without money, I couldn't open a bank account, couldn't rent a room, couldn't even prove who I was. At first, I slept in bus stations, clutching myself against the cold. I picked up odd jobs when someone trusted me enough to pay cash, moving boxes, hauling scrap. But without an address, without papers, doors closed faster than I could knock. Hunger sharpened, dignity eroded, and slowly I slipped into the margins where people stopped seeing you. I bought a hat at a thrift store for $1. Pulled low, it gave me anonymity, a shield against the stares. It was easier to be invisible than to face the pity or suspicion in people's eyes. That's how I drifted from Philadelphia to Lancaster, following nothing but the instinct to survive. Daniel's voice faltered then, and he looked down at our joined hands. That's how I lost everything, Linda. Family, home, work, my very name. One day I was someone. The next I was no one. I held his hand tighter. The man across from me wasn't no one. Not to me. When Daniel finished speaking, silence filled the room. I sat across from him at the kitchen table, my hand still wrapped around his, my heart aching for the boy he had been, the man he had become, the years stolen from him by betrayal. I wanted to cry for his parents, for the house that was no longer theirs, for the company that had been ripped away, for the way the world had discarded him. But more than that, I felt a swell of respect. Somehow, after all of it, he was still here, still breathing, still capable of love. You didn't lose everything, I said softly. You still have yourself. And now you have me. That's a start. He shook his head, eyes heavy. I don't even have a name that counts anymore. No home, no papers. You deserve better than a man starting from nothing. I squeezed his hand tighter. Then we'll build it back, piece by piece. We'll get your papers in order. A new ID, a new social security card. And once you're ready, we'll find work. Doesn't matter if it's small. A job is a job. We start there. He looked at me, searching for doubt, for pity. But I gave him neither. I gave him the steadiness I wished someone had given me after I lost my husband. After a long pause, he nodded. All right, he said. From the ground up, I'll do it. Not because I want to prove myself to the world, but because I want to prove myself worthy of sitting across from you. In the weeks that followed, we made slow progress. The county office stamped his forms. A temporary ID arrived in the mail. He started small, helping a neighbor repair a fence, patching shingles on a roof. Paid in cash, but honest work. Each time he came home with sore muscles and dirt on his hands. I saw not the broken man who had been discarded, but the builder returning to life. One Saturday evening, we drove back out to the cabin. The air was cool, carrying the smell of wood smoke and damp pine. Daniel carried a basket with bread and cheese, insisting on preparing supper himself. I followed him into the yard, where the stars stretched across the black sky like diamonds scattered on velvet. We sat on the porch steps, shoulders touching, the silence between us no longer heavy but full. He pointed out Orion again, tracing the constellations as he had the first night. Only this time, I didn't just see stars. I saw a future, uncertain, fragile, but ours. Do you ever regret it? I asked quietly, not fighting harder for what was stolen. He thought for a moment, then shook his head. If I had stayed in that fight, I wouldn't be here now. I'd still be chained to anger, bitterness. But I found you instead. That feels like winning. I leaned against him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the hollow ache of loneliness. I didn't feel the weight of an empty bed or the silence of unanswered birthdays. What I felt was presence, partnership, a life beginning again. The past had been cruel, merciless in the way it stripped him bare. But here in the quiet hills of Pennsylvania, under a sky wide enough to hold our sorrows and our hopes, I believed what he said. The future belonged to us, not as what we had lost, but as what we would build together.